Today, we count down the top 10 most valuable and most important DC comics of the year 1971. These are all ranked based on their prices in the Overstreet Annual Price Guide. Let's go through the countdown. Starting at number 10 of the year, this is a major important book. It's been expensive for decades now. Ultra cool on our list. It's Weird War Tales #1. And this is the first issue of a horror series that would run for 124 issues, one of DC's most successful 1970s Bronze Age titles. #1 is a 52-page giant. It even has a Nazi logo on the cover. We have Joe Kubert art here. And this book, it used to be a cheap book that everyone ignored. And back in the 90s, it was $1.50 basically in the guide. And then by 1998, it jumped to $150. Now it ranks 10th of the entire year and 17th most valuable DC comic of the 1970s. It's also the #1 most valuable DC war comic of the 1970s. Print run estimated at approximately 159,000 copies. On the CGC census, you can see it's still growing. There's demand for this book. 355 copies in all grades combined. There are 19 high-grade copies, 9.6 or higher on the census. Heritage Auctions has sold 61 copies of this book since they started auctioning off comics in the year 2000. Classic ghoulish cover here. In the Overstreet Price Guide, we can see the growth over a long period of time here. You can see if you invested in low-grade copies, this book has not moved at all in like 2 decades. In high grade, it's also been stalled for a decade, but it does have a hefty price of $500 for raw 9.2 copies. And if you want to see how much the higher grade copies are, check out the CGC listings sold auctions on eBay, as well as gpanalysis.com if you're curious about all the past CGC sales. Summing up the CGC census, we have 4 9.8s and 15 9.6s. #9 of the year, this is a major key, Batman 234. This is the first appearance of Two-Face since the Golden Age. Yes, we've been waiting for decades for Two-Face to come back, and here he is, from writer Denny O'Neil and artist Neal Adams, who was super hot at this time, definitely the most collected DC artist of the early 1970s. This is the first 52-page giant that would run every issue starting with this issue. This is the 4th most valuable Batman issue of the 1970s. Print run estimated at only 244,000 copies. Batman and Detective actually were not big sellers for DC in the 1970s. It ranks 9th of the year and 15th of the entire decade. The census is quickly growing on this book, over 1,100 copies graded, 58 high-grade copies. Heritage has sold 101 of these. So another 25-cent giant issue here. In the Overstreet Price Guide, in low grade, again, not much movement at all in the last decade. It's still a pretty cheap book. But in high grade, it had a big bump just this last year alone, now $550. On the census, there are 18 9.8s and 40 9.6s. #8, DC 100-page Super Spectacular #4. This is actually the first issue of the series, so it's technically a #1. People have debated why this series starts with a #4. It is the first issue, and it's Weird Mystery Tales. So this is a horror title. It's the first 100-page giant that DC ever released. So this is a major important book, new format that DC would run for the next 5 years off and on. This classic horror title has this tough black background cover. We have Bernie Wrightson artwork. This is the 2nd most valuable DC horror comic of the 1970s, and it is the first 100-page DC comic. It's got a hefty cover price of 50 cents when comics were only 15 cents. So pretty pricey at that time. Hard to say how well it sold. We're going with a print run estimated of 100,000 copies. It ranks 8th of the year and 13th of the decade. On the census, there are 164 copies graded. Only 4 high-grade. Heritage has sold 32. And in the Overstreet Price Guide, again, not much growth at all in low grade. It's just another cheap, affordable book. High grade, though, has been sneaking up year by year, now $625. There are no 9.8s in this book, but there are 4 9.6s and 3 9.4s. Next on our countdown, in 7th place, we have Green Lantern 87. And this is part of the classic Green Lantern Green Arrow team-up run from Neal Adams, featuring his artwork in each issue. This key issue has the first appearance of John Stewart and the second appearance of Guy Gardner, 2 Green Lanterns. And, of course, we have Hal Jordan, the main Green Lantern. This is another 52-page giant, 25-cent cover price. It's the 11th issue of the Lantern Green Arrow team-up series. Ranked 7th of the year, 11th of the decade. Print run estimated at a low 142,000 copies. Green Lantern also was not a big seller in the early 70s, despite the classic stories and artwork that are so now acclaimed 50 years later. 1,300 copies created by CGC, 87 high grade, 79 sold at Heritage. White background cover on this 25-cent giant. Overstreet Price Guide shows actually this book has not been stalling in any grade. It's actually moving in all grades year by year. Still affordable in low grades. It's now made a big jump this year. It's now a $700 book. There are 33 9.8s and 54 9.6s, a lot on the census. Next on our ranking, in 6th place is the rarest book on our list, which is why it makes the top 10. Super DC Giant, number 21, also known as S21. Love 1971 is the theme. This is a love romance special issue in the series. And it's also a 25-cent giant size issue, 64 pages. And this has always been one of the rarest DC comics of the 1970s. It's also the second most valuable DC romance book of the decade. It ranks 6th of the year overall and 12th of the decade. Print run estimated 100,000 copies, but not many surviving. On the census, you can see only 57 copies graded. There are 5 high-grade copies, and Heritage has only sold 6 copies ever. White background cover of this psychedelic color romance comic. In the Overstreet Price Guide, again, low grades not really moving at all for a long time. Book is just inching its way up in high grade, not much movement in the last decade, but it is a $700 book now. On the census, there's only 1 9.8 and 4 9.6s. Which brings us to number 5 on our countdown, Detective Comics 400, a special anniversary issue featuring the origin and first appearance of Man-Bat. This issue also is the first Robin Batgirl team-up. And we have Neal Adams cover and interior art. Print run estimated at 209,000 copies. It's the second most valuable issue of Detective Comics in the 70s. It's the number 5 book of the year and 10th of the decade. This is such a major key for numerous reasons. On the census, it's really growing. 944 copies graded, 32 high grade. Heritage sold 82. Blue background cover. In the Overstreet Price Guide, this book has been moving up every year in all grades. And now it's an $800 book. On the census, there are 9 9.8s and 23 9.6s. Number 4 of the year is another issue of Detective Comics. It's number 411. The first appearance of Talia al Ghul, the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, who is mentioned but doesn't appear until Batman 232. This is a Neal Adams bondage cover, and we've also got Batgirl in this issue in a backup story. Bob Brown art, print run estimated 199,000 copies. This is a regular 15-cent cover price book. It ranks 4th of the year, 9th of the decade. 674 copies graded by CGC, 13 high-grade copies, only 48 sold by Heritage. Black background. Overstreet Price Guide slowly sneaking up in all grades year by year, now a $900 book. But you can see a decade ago, this book is actually quadrupled in low grades and tripled in high grades. So this book is definitely moving. There are 4 9.8s and 9 9.6s of this book. In 3rd place, Batman's pretty popular this year. And we get Batman 232, the Daughter of the Demon storyline, the first appearance of the villain Ra's al Ghul. And we've got Neal Adams art on this one. This is a classic green tone cover. We got Denny O'Neil writing, Dick Giordano inks. Print run estimated 244,000 copies, ranks 3rd of the year, 6th of the entire decade. And this is the second most valuable issue of Batman of the 1970s. The census is going crazy. 2,400 copies graded, even 184 ultra high grade copies. Heritage has sold 189 of this classic cover. In the Overstreet price guide, low grades have been moving slow but steady every year. And now in high grade, this is now a $1,000 book. 61 9.8s and 123 9.6s. Well, where does that bring us on our countdown? To number 2. And this is known as the rarest DC comic of the entire 1970s. It's DC 100-page super spectacular number 5. The theme is love stories. Now remember, this is the second issue of the DC 100-page series, and it's the first romance issue. This is the first 100-page romance comic put out by DC. They would put out a bunch later on, a few years later. So, as people hunted for this book, especially pre-internet days, people just couldn't find this book anywhere. This is the most valuable DC romance comic of the 70s, in fact, from any publisher. Print run estimated 100,000 copies, ranked 2nd of the year and 3rd of the entire decade for DC. There are only 85 copies on the census, 0 high-grade copies. Heritage has sold 17 copies since the year 2000. Classic cover. This is one of my favorite books. I do own copies of this book. I love it. In the Overstreet price guide, you can see the book has not had much movement, though, in the last 20 years in low grades. But in high grades, you can see in the last decade, it's gone up 30%. So we have a $1,400 book. It's not a fast mover now because it's already so pricey. Not a lot of romance collectors, but Rarity and DC Bronze Age collectors need this in their collection as completists. We have 85 copies on the census. The highest are 3 at 9.4 and 5 at 9.2. Well, that brings us to the number 1 most important DC comic of 1971. And there's no doubt about it. This is the book. Everyone wants it. It's the number 1 most valuable DC comic of 1971. It is the most valuable DC comic of the entire 1970s. It is the first appearance of Swamp Thing before he was truly established later on with his own series. Classic Bernie Wrightson horror cover, House of Secrets, number 92. This book is ranked number 1 of the year for many, many, many years. For a while, Green Lantern 76 had actually overtaken it for the entire decade. But this is back to being the number 1 DC Bronze book that everybody needs in their collection. We've also got Jeff Jones inks and Michael Kaluta. This was the first 1970s DC comic to ever hit the $1,000 mark, which happened back in 2008. It's the 11th most valuable DC horror comic of all time. Print run estimated 175,000 copies. On the census, we have almost 2,500 copies graded, but only 29 high grade due to the dark cover. Heritage has sold 229 copies. In the Overstreet price guide, this book has been on fire for the last 6 years. But before that, believe it or not, it was stalled for the longest time. Look at the low grades. It actually fell in price year by year a decade ago. But now it's on fire in all grades, and it's leaping year by year at this point. This is a $4,500 book in raw 9.2. On the census, there are only 3 9.8s. There are 26 9.6s. Now we're going to take the top 10 books of the year and compare them on the CGC census just to see what's happening. Well, of course, we've got House of Secrets 92 and Batman 232 are the 2 big iconic books that everybody wants. Over 2,400 copies graded of both of those books. On the low end, of course, we have the 2 romance issues, very low on the census. And everything else is sort of in between. So notice that this was basically a non-superhero year, but also a big Batman and Neal Adams year for collectors. Now, which books all have 9.8s? Well, all of them except the 200-page issues do not have 9.8s at all. Again, due to the thickness of the spine and everything, easy to damage. And in fact, the 100-page number 5 doesn't even have 9.6s. Which book has the most copies really at the high end? Well, it actually is Batman 232. It's way in the lead with 184 copies grading 9.6 or higher. That's a lot of copies. And on the low end, of course, again, the romance comics are way at the other end. There you go. Top 10 books of DC from 1971, the year I was born. It's a great year. I love these comics. Great covers, great artwork, classic characters. We do this series every week going year by year, teaching the history of DC Comics and investing. So please subscribe to this channel, and we thank you for watching.